We have overcast light whether we like it or not, Jordan, so despite all the features of this camera being great for action and taking portraits and stuff, puddles. It's gonna be puddles today. I will do portraits reflected in puddles too. Welcome back to DP Review TV viewers, Chris Nichols here, and today we're looking at the pocket-sized RX100 7 now. We're up to 7. I really don't want to do a full spec rundown. In fact, check out Kerry Rose's video on dpreview.com. He did a charming, absolutely fantastic intro to this camera. I really want to focus today on using this camera with the features that set it apart from the rest of this series. We're talking about autofocus and video capabilities. So join me, let's get using this camera. No, that's not the one. Who's going to be a hub of human energy? I am wishing this had a built-in ND. So what has really changed on the version 7 RX100? Well, it starts with a brand new sensor. It's still a 1-inch type 20 megapixel sensor, but we've got upgraded DRAM and all sorts of improvements, and Kerry's already talked about all the technical stuff. The fact is, it's much faster. Now this leads us to another benefit. This new sensor now gives us insanely fast frame per second shooting. We're gonna talk about that. It also means that we don't get any blackout time while we're actually shooting at 20 frames per second. That's a really nice advantage as well. Now that leads us to some autofocus improvements too on this camera. The sensor now gives us better AF coverage across more of the frame, but this also now incorporates very similar capabilities to the Sony A9. We get real-time tracking, we get face and eye detect focus, we also get the animal eye detect focus, and this should all make this an ultimate camera for family shooting, travel, pets, that kind of stuff, maybe even some light sport action and wildlife. Now the RX100 6, that shot 24 frames per second in electronic shutter at its fastest burst mode, and that was very impressive. However, you're always seeing the very last frame you took, so you always felt like you were a step behind. The version 7 now shoots 20 frames per second, but 0 blackout, and you see things real time. It's way better to track moving subjects in action. I think it's definitely a worthwhile trade-off. Now again, remember this is all based only when you're using the electronic shutter. You can't shoot forever, but I'm getting 80 shots with RAW plus JPEG. I mean, before it slows down, that's pretty impressive. And I really feel like I'm gonna use the 20 frame per second burst mode primarily when I'm shooting. But it can go faster than that. Because of this new sensor and the faster readout, you can then use this electronic shutter at even higher frames per second. You can push up to a maximum of 90 frames per second for 7 pictures. Now you have to appreciate that is a very tiny window. And if I was using it for action in sports, honestly, I feel like it's quite difficult unless you're very good at anticipating that moment. Now you can slow it down and extend your window 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second, but personally, I think just going to 20 frames per second with no blackout time with a much longer window of shooting is far more useful. I have a complaint. I don't like the shutter on this. It's way too sensitive for me. I like having a more positive half press, so it'll take some practice to get used to it. And with this, I find it's just firing frames way before I actually want to. So that's driving me crazy. Now the lens on the RX100 Mark 7 at 24 to 200, 2.8 to 4.5 has been borrowed as well from its predecessor. And I've already read a lot of people saying, oh, I wish we could get that 24 to 70 with the faster aperture back. That would really make it shine. But, you know, I think in my opinion, what Sony's really starting to do now is try to differentiate this camera from what smartphones can do. And certainly smartphones are not quite able to touch that 24 to 200 kind of optical range right now. Okay, so I'm taking a picture of a flower here, and I just want to mention a couple things that I'm challenged with right now. First off, this is the light we have today. It's overcast, it's not dark, but we're in the shade of a lot of buildings and stuff. 100 ISO at f4.5, the fastest aperture on this lens at 200mm equivalent, I'm only getting 30th of a second. It's not fast enough to get sharp pictures here, even with the stabilizer, my face up to the viewfinder. So this is going to be one of the issues with this longer lens. We are losing that faster aperture in low light situations, or even on an overcast day. Expect that you're going to have to crank your ISO up a bit, and of course the hit and image quality that's going to cause. Of course the sensor is quite decent at higher ISOs, but it's not ideal. The other thing I would say, This is my minimum distance from the camera to that flower. I cannot get any closer at 200 millimeters. So it does work for portraits. I am actually getting a nice soft back separation from the background, but it's not super close. And if I move in and use the wide angle to get closer, this is still not the greatest macro camera out there. Look at this, Jordan. It's 2019 and world's state-of-the-art face detect focusing cannot pick up a humongous giant wire face. This camera's the worst camera ever. Totally jank, useless AF, no point. Oh, I could real-time track, that works, okay, never mind. So I've been playing with this 7-shot high-speed burst mode, and honestly, I think I'd really relegate this to more still life stuff. It'd be useful for macro shots where you're really trying to get that one moment in focus, for example, but you know, it makes me feel that I wish this camera had more of like a pre-buffered mode, a lot like what Olympus and Panasonic are doing. They're doing it right, and I don't see why we can't have it here, because there is a pre-buffer option when you're shooting slow-mo video, but not for stills. It'd be infinitely more useful than 90 frames per second, in my opinion. Now, as is very typical of super zoom pocket-sized cameras like this, battery life's not great, just under 400 shots SEPA rated, so I'm definitely trying not to leave the camera on while I'm walking around. But of course, like any big zoom camera as well, when I turn it on, there's a slight delay waiting for everything to kick in. It's not bad, but it's really the way to shoot this camera because I do not want to lose any battery life today. So if you're a regular viewer, you know that I've often poo-pooed the Fuji side flip screen where it pops out, but it'd actually be super helpful right now. Now, if you are shooting at high frame rates, as we've talked about already, you're going to be in electronic shutter mode, but luckily on these cameras, electronic shutters are great. I mean, silent if you want them to be, and as you can see here, very minimal rolling shutter, even with a pretty fast pan. So overall, very little restrictions. Oh, geez. I have dropped this camera inadvertently like 3 times just walking around with it. Wrist strap, obviously a good idea, but 7 versions, really? We can't get any texture on this thing yet? I don't get it. For me, by far the biggest improvement on this camera is going to be the addition of real-time autofocus tracking. This is a feature we talked about with the Sony a6400. The A9 has it as well, and it just basically simplifies the entire autofocusing process on the camera, which is especially good here on a camera where, frankly, we don't have a lot of customizability for back button focusing or setting eye autofocus. You know, the buttons are all on the control pad and kind of low and out of place, so it really helps here. Basically, I can just have the camera set to a tracking mode. If it sees a face, it'll focus on a face. If it sees eyes, it'll focus on the eyes. It'll intelligently track subjects. I can also use the otherwise poorly implemented touch features on this camera to just touch on the screen where I want, and it starts tracking that subject. The other nice thing about machine learning autofocusing techniques is, as Sony hopefully improves these over time, they can theoretically add other features or improve things like the animal eye detect, which is still kind of hit or miss. Overall though, I think that for most people, you're never gonna have to go out of real-time tracking on these cameras, and that's so much less to have to worry about and think about on a camera like this. Now, as far as displays go, this is all essentially the exact same as the 6. You know, we've got our vlog style screen, which is great, gives us nice separation for waist level shooting, but it doesn't go side to side for articulation. And again, we have that automatic finder, no need to pull it out. And of course, I can set it to turn on or off the camera as I see fit. Nice and easy to click it closed. Now, unfortunately, Sony has still carried over the exact same weak touchscreen interface. In playback, I can't pinch to zoom or anything. I can just double tap to zoom. There's no scrolling through photos. I can't use the touchscreen in the menu interface at all. The only thing that really is the silver lining to that is for real-time tracking. It is handy to be able to touch on the screen and get that locked in, but that's about all you're going to use that touchscreen interface for.
Jordan here to talk about video, and Sony's made a really big deal about the RX100 as a vlogging camera, and I've always loved the RX100 line for their video quality, and they use a lot of these sensors in some of their prosumer video cameras. Very crisp image coming out of them, and very minimal rolling shutter as well, which I really love. But they've got some serious improvements on this, and the biggest one is we now have tracking with eye detect in video. So right now I'm using their touch tracking, tapped on my face and it's doing a nice job. Only issue, it does not want to track you when you get really close to it. You might see it kind of fall off or hesitate there. But from a fully outstretched arm, it's doing a really nice job. Now the other upgrade that we've seen is we now have their active stabilization when you're in video mode. So right now I'm just using standard optical with the lens. Okay, and now we've switched over to the active mode. And I really like this. There's a minor crop when we switch over to this, very small, but what I like is it's using the whole vertical area of the sensor to minimize vertical bounce, which is usually what you're fighting with when you're walking and holding a camera like I am right now. Now the other thing we've been begging Sony for a very long time is a mic jack, and they've delivered with this. Now, unfortunately there's no shoe on the camera, so I'm just using a wired lav going straight in. Works really nicely. You will need to get a separate bracket if you want to use something like a shotgun mic or have the receiver for a wireless mic, but I'm still thrilled to see this inclusion on it. It's just funny that we saw it the exact same time that Canon brought out the G7X Mark III. Now the other thing I love about this camera is the slow motion recording on it. We can shoot at 240, 480, and 960 frames per second. I'm not a big fan of the 480 and 960, quality's pretty bad on it, but at 240 frames per second, the quality is brilliant on it. Unfortunately though, you have very short record times and the same system we've seen since the RX100 IV, a very clunky setup where you have to set up all your camera settings and then go into standby mode and hit record. A little clunky. I'd love to see that addressed at this point. We're getting by on a day like today without having any ND filters, but in a bright day, you're really going to need them if you want nice smooth movement. And unfortunately, none of the RX100 cameras since the Mark V have had them. So you can get some third-party options to mount them onto the lens, but it is still a little bit clunky, which seems to be kind of a theme in this. Now, one other thing I'm getting asked about all the time is the overheating on these cameras. Now, going back to the RX100 IV, they've had a 5-minute record limit when you're shooting 4K, and that's still there in the standard mode. However, you have the option to turn it on to a auto power off high, where the camera will get hot. It's not super comfortable to hold by hand. You'll want to grab some sort of grip like I'm using now, or put the camera on a tripod. Then you will get longer record times. I've gotten 25 minutes without any issues, but certainly it's not something where you're going to want to hand hold the camera, and it doesn't inspire confidence when you're holding a super hot, super expensive piece of tech. One other thing I do really like is the inclusion of all of Sony's standard picture profiles on this. You have their regular picture profiles for a 709 profile. We've got S-Log2, which I like to use in high contrast scenes, S-Log3, which I'm not a fan of with these 8-bit cameras, and also the HLG recording, which is my favorite option when you've got a very large dynamic range. Just make sure you know how to work with that in post. But it's a very full-featured camera. The only real limitations to it come down to the size of the camera, but these are a lot of welcome, much-needed improvements. This is one of the best B cameras ever made.
So now there seems to be a lot of debate on the merits of 1-inch type cameras over smartphones and if they're even necessary. So I'm going to just kick out a whole bunch of really fast points because I think both camps actually have some very, very good advantages and some very good points. Smartphones, the ergonomics still suck to use in a lot of cases as far as holding the cameras, no tilt screens, no viewfinders. However, the argument that the image quality is very comparable, I would largely agree with that. Between wide and normal optical ranges and good light, you're not going to see much difference. And with computational photography, like you get on the Pixel 3 with its night sight mode, and what a lot of other cameras are going to start doing as well, I actually think you get better image quality in low light than the RX100 VII, even though Sony has some very decent JPEG noise reduction software. But the Sony RX100 VII hits right back. First off, that 24-200 equivalent lens, you cannot reach that with a smartphone without digital zooming, and you still lose a lot of quality there. So I think that's a big reason why Sony is leaving that longer range in these cameras. On top of that, having the viewfinder inspires confidence and works great in bright sunlight. And for me, that real-time autofocus tracking gives you a huge success rate in capturing your memories. And it's as easy to use as a smartphone now. That's a big part of it. It's simple. Good points on both. I think you got to consider that one negative with the 1-inch type cameras now, they're getting crazy expensive. So yeah, the Sony RX100 VII is a very expensive camera. You do get a lot for your money there, but Jordan and I are going to do a shootout between the Canon PowerShot G5X2 and the G7X3. But just to give you a quick little teaser there, although more affordable and in my personal opinion, having more desirable lenses, you're still having to choose. Do I want a mic jack or do I want an EVF? I can't get both, and that's unfortunate. With the RX100 VII, we get everything. We get a viewfinder, we get a mic jack, we get a big optical zoom range, great image quality, and most importantly, the best autofocus on the market, bar none, in this class of camera. But you do pay a lot of money for it, and I think that's going to be a trend that we're just going to see going up and up, higher and higher as we go further and further into this market. I hope you guys found this review useful on the RX100 Mark VII. There is a lot here to look at if you can afford that price of admission. Now, of course, you know the drill, so please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Check out our Instagram and Twitter feeds, and let us know how you feel. Is this 1-inch type market on its way out, or is there still a lot of validity here? Smartphones are going to get better and better, but I still think this is a very compelling camera, and at the least, a very powerful piece of tech that we can appreciate, even if we're not going to be able to buy one ourselves.